It's a high-tech conversation.
And a low-tech topic.
Live on the World Wide Web via Zoom. Bench Talk 101.
Welcome everybody to this week's episode of Bench Talk 101. Obviously in the news we're listening to lots more cases every day. We're over 6,000 confirmed cases every day. At the college we had our first confirmed case, so we had to go through the protocol with the Department for Education and go through all of the rules where we had to identify the people that were close contacts, and it's full going. It's concerning for us all, really, the amount here, and what we need is for people to make sure that they do their social distancing so that this doesn't spread anymore. We heard on the news this week that if we can carry on at this rate, we're going to get to 50,000 cases a day. So it's concerning. Anyway, back to Bench Talk 101. This is where it's all safe and we can share our expertise and skills. And I'm really delighted that we've got Richard, who's come back for a second talk. I think you've been to every single Bench Talk that we've had so far, which is really, really great. But what I'm going to do is hand you over to Richard. Richard's going to talk to us about his first Norris. And apparently there's a really interesting tale here of what happened there. So without further ado, I suggest that you all put your mode into speaker view and listen up to Richard, to what he's got to say. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. I'm seeing you, Geoffrey. Does that matter?
You can see me.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fine. Let me just put this on gallery view. Right. Good evening, everybody. I know quite a few of you already know me, but for those that don't, my name is Richard Arnold. I work as a professional woodworker, as a joiner and cabinet maker. And apart from that, I have a very keen interest in 18th century woodworking tools and studying them, collecting them and what have you. But today I really wanted to sort of talk about something else other than 18th century planes, and talk as a user of tools rather than a collector of tools. That's quite important in this aspect. I started out as a joiner, and most joiners do back in the 70s or whatever. Our first planes that we use are probably the same sort of planes that everybody starts to use. This was my first ever plane, which is a number 4 with various different bits and bobs in it, and it actually belonged to my grandfather. It's had chunks chipped out of it. There's 2 lumps missing out of the casting, but it served me well as an apprentice, and it was my first plane. I still love it in a way, but I don't really use it anymore. But as I went through my apprenticeship, I started getting more interested in woodworking outside of the job, and I started taking woodworking magazines, and I was a very keen reader of the Woodworker at the time, and I started to hear rumours about a strange plane called Norris Planes, and they were often referred to as the Rolls Royce of planes. And I became quite interested in them. Didn't know a lot about them, but I was talking to a work colleague, fairly older chap, and he said he got one of these Norris planes at home. And although this talk is about my first ever Norris, we're going to be talking about my first true Norris that I really loved. But the first ever Norris I got was actually a smoothing plane. I don't own it anymore. I actually swapped it with David Stanley for something else. But it was what they call an A50, which was a smoother. I knew nothing of the value of them back then, and neither did the colleague who I worked with. And he said he'd sell it to me, but he didn't know what to charge me for it. So he said, well, nip down to the ironmongers, see how much a new Stanley is, and we'll just call it that. So I went down, and a new Stanley at the time was £25. So that's what I paid him for it, which quite amazing when I think back. And it was what they call an A50, and Norris is famous for patenting in 1913 the adjuster. which was the first sort of infill plane that had a proper adjuster on it. Lots of people rave about the adjuster. Personally, I hate them. I tried the plane for a while, never really got on with it, but put it to one side, never really used it. As I said, I carried on reading magazines, and one of the articles I used to read regularly was by a guy called David Savage. I don't know whether a lot of you are familiar with him. He sadly passed away recently, but he was a very fine cabinet maker, and he was a great lover of vintage tools. And I remember reading an article about what he called a panel plane. I had no idea what a panel plane was to start with, but I soon learned that it was a larger Norris style plane, sort of similar in size to maybe a number 5 Stanley or Record or whatever. But I started to see some illustrations of them in books and what have you, and decided that I'd really like to own one. As time went by, I'd finished my apprenticeship, and I was coming up to my 21st birthday, which was, I think we worked it out earlier, this is 37 years ago now. And my mother said to me, is there anything you'd really like for your 21st birthday? And I said, well, you know, I really love a Norris panel plane. We looked into where I might be able to buy one from, and I found out that the very famous auctioneer David Stanley at the time had a shop in Derby, which wasn't a million miles away from us. And so I rang the shop up and said, have you got any Norris panel planes? And the guy on the other end of the line says, yeah, I think we've got 4 or 5 in stock at the moment. I said, would it be all right to pop up to the shop and have a look one day? And he said, that's fine. So me and my mother got out the fateful old Bedford HA van, which was my first vehicle, and we trundled our way up to Derby. This is before the age of sat-nav, so it was like a map book on my mother's lap and me driving, and we finally found it in a very dodgy back street area of Derby. You know, I was glad I was in a Bedford HA, because I don't think if I'd been thinking any posher, the wheels might have been missing when I came back out. But we found the shop, and it was an Aladdin's cave of tools. And we walked in, and there was what can only describe as a very interesting character running the shop, who I asked David about yesterday at the sale, because I couldn't quite remember his name, and his name was Cab. We've no idea why he was called Cab, and David doesn't know what his real name was, but he was called Cab. And if any of you are ever familiar with watching Peaky Blinders, if you can think of a character out of Peaky Blinders complete with the Cap, this was Cap. I said to Cal, I said, well, I rang up about the Norris panel planes, and I've come to have a look at them. And he looked me up and down, thought, you know, a young whippersnapper. And the first thing he asked me, sort of quite scathing, he said, well, what are you? Are you a collector or a user? And I said, oh, no, you know, I'm a joiner. I want to use the plane. And I think his whole demeanour changed then. He warmed to me a bit then. But the first, he said to me, he said, well, if you're a user, he says, you really ought to try them out before you make your mind up which one you want. And he got 4 or 5 of them there. And I now realise now that about 4 of them were adjustable ones, but they were probably what we tend to call late model, which aren't what I call real Norrises. They were made after the Second World War by a different company, and they've got sort of usually got beech infills that are stained to an ebony colour. But I was sort of naive enough to think I really wanted an adjustable one. Anyway, Cab said to me, he says, yeah, in the shop they actually had a bench, a full-size joiner's bench in the shop itself. And he said, what I'll do is I'll put the planes on the bench, and we'll put a bit of wood in the vise, try each one, and then make up your mind which one you want. So that's what we did. And then he turned around and said one of the strangest things. I'll never forget it. And I'm glad my mother was there at the time, chaperoning, because he says, what I'm going to do, though, he says, before you try these out, I'm going to put a blindfold on you. And that's exactly what he did. He got an old handkerchief or something and he blindfolded me. He said, what I want you to do is pick each of those planes up in turn and just have a go with them. And before you take the blindfold off, tell me which one you want. And that's exactly what he did. Now, I tried them all out, and one of them, it just felt special in the hand. And I didn't understand quite why, but I thought, this one just feels completely different. This is the plane for me. So when I took the blindfold off, I found myself holding this plane here. And I've never regretted it to this day since choosing this plane. It was the one non-adjustable one among the 5, and I'll never regret making that choice. As it turned out, it is a very, very special plane, not just to me, but I think it's probably one of the finest Norrises I've ever seen. So what I want to do now, what I wanted to say about that little tail, I wanted to say it's almost like an urban myth, that tail, because I've told it so many times to various woodworkers, particularly at shows and stuff. And over the years, I've had people come up to me and tell me that tale about, they've seen my Norris, not knowing it's the plane and not knowing that I was the actual person who told the tale in the first place. They've told me that story as though it was somebody else, that they'd heard it from somebody else. So it's become a bit of an urban myth, but that is the actual true facts of what really happened. As to the plane itself, it's what Norris termed as a number 1. He gave his planes various numbers, and anything that was above 13.5 inches up to the jointers, which he did make up to 36 inches, they were all called the number 1. This one is actually 15.5 inches long, which is a bit of an unusual size. They're either normally 13.5 or 14.5, and you get a few 17.5. The 15.5 and 16.5 don't crop up all that often, but it's probably dates from around, I would estimate, probably 1890 to maybe 1910 at a rough guess. It's one of the reasons it's so special to me, not just because it's my plane. One of the things about infills, they've got such a reputation, but I've bought a few over the years, but they don't always perform as well as you perhaps hope they would. The one big difference with this plane is that it is all original, which is, in infill terms, is quite rare. The iron and the back iron and everything are stamped and numbered up. So if Geoffrey could just put a slide up for me, the first slide, Geoffrey, and we'll just go through that. This is probably give you a better image of the plane in itself. As I said, it's 15.5 inches long. I don't know how well you can see this on the screen. As is most of the early Norrises, apart from the very early ones, it's of dovetail construction. It's not a casting, so it is made of steel plates dovetailed together. You can actually see just the vague hint of the dovetails along the bottom edge there. On this second slide, you can go to the second slide, Geoffrey. You'll see on the bed here a number. It's upside down, but it says 6P. Now, this is a batch number when he was making the planes. It's something I've been studying for a while. Most of the planes, Norris planes you see, and some of the other makers of infill planes like Matheson and Spears, they made planes in batches and they're usually numbered, but it's usually just a single number. But this has got a P after the 6, and I still really don't quite know what that stands for. For a long while, I thought it perhaps actually meant panel, for panel plane. But at various sales, I have examined other Norris planes, and I have found smoothers with the P after a number. The only other slight theory I've got is that maybe different workers in the factory sometimes put their own mark after the number, so they know they've made that plane. So it may have been Peter or something like that, but I'm not 100% sure. That number also, if you go to the next slide, Geoffrey, appears on the back of the iron. I've done this the wrong way round. The iron in the plane is marked by Ward and Payne. Now, I think the earliest Norrises were all probably fitted with Ward and Payne irons. As time went by, Norris started to put his own mark on irons, and you'll see Norris of London on a lot of the later irons, but I think the earliest planes were by Ward and Payne. If we go to the next slide, Geoffrey, this is the back side of the iron, and you'll see that same mark there, 6P. It's also stamped on the back side of the lever cap casting as well. So all parts of the plane are marked with that 6P. The iron is what we call a parallel iron, as in it's not tapered at all. And the other great thing about these early Norris plane irons is I think he probably got the irons from Ward, but then he must have surface ground and regularized the irons so they are absolutely perfectly parallel and polished ground to a fine finish. This sort of makes them easier to fit to the bed of the plane. We tend to think of Norris, I think some people have a romantic view of a man working in a back street in London in a small workshop making all these planes by hand, but I've recently been examining them all along with a colleague, friend of mine, Oliver Sparks, who some of you may know, and Oliver pointed out to me that on the bed of the plane, where the slot has been relieved out of the bed of the plane for the screw on the iron, that slot has been milled out on a milling machine. So Norris must have had some quite sophisticated engineering equipment to do that. And I said to Ollie immediately, I said, well, you know, did they have milling machines back then? He said, well, the actual first milling machines came in about 1812. So by the end of the 19th century, yeah, they were in fairly common use. So although he was making woodworking planes, I think he had quite a sophisticated engineering workshop as well, even at that early point. If we just go to the next slide, Geoffrey. One of the things you'll always find on Norris planes that are dovetailed is this little mark in the front edge where it says steel. You can always tell a dovetail plane by that mark. Alex Matheson, who also made infill planes, use that mark, but on later Mathesons, the mark is slightly different. Now, I'm not going to rabbit on too long about this because there's people on here who probably know far more about infills, and I wanted this talk to be about infills and what makes them so special. So I won't talk for too long because I want people to be able to ask questions, get more questions in, and actually bring other people like Bill and Sarah Carter in to discuss and possibly show a few of their infill planes as well. The plane itself, as I was explaining, I use it almost on a daily basis. So it is not a collectible item to me. I have used it for the last 37 years. I mean, some of you know I make wooden planes. I love my wooden planes, but when I'm doing the final finishing on the wooden planes, this is still the plane that I choose to use to finish the surfaces of those wooden planes. It is absolutely superb. When it comes to difficult grain on any hardwoods, it's just phenomenal. The mouth on it is so tight as well. A really, really tight mouth. And I think a cabinet maker once said to me, who saw it, he said, I can't really quite understand why people rave about infill so much, but he says, I can imagine that if you're using a plane like that, something that well made would sort of encourage you to work in a way where you were trying to work to the same standard as the plane you were using. And I relate to that. Every time I pick this plane up, it still brings a feeling to me. I don't know, but it makes me want to work to a higher standard every time I pick the plane up. I think that's something that's quite magical about infill planes. So I wanted to keep this short so we could have more time for questions about infills and to bring in other people like Bill to discuss it and show theirs. So if anybody's got any questions or whatever, please just shout out. And I think Bill may have a couple of other Norrises to show you as well. All right, Geoffrey.
Brilliant. Well, Richard, thank you very, very much. And it's really interesting to hear all the different parts, particularly the 6P that you've got there. I have a smaller Norris, okay?
Yeah.
And this is stamped 1P. So on all the parts is 1P.
1P. Oh, yeah. So yours is P as well, yeah. So that's a number 13, if for the looks of it, is it?
This one, yeah. It's had a bit of a hard life.
Yeah.
We'll go into that later, but it's just interesting that it's 1P, the same as what you were talking there.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So if people want to put their names in the chat, we can we can run away with that. Let me just allow people to unmute themselves from there. Okay, so first up is Shrenik.
Hi, Richard. Thank you very much.
Hi, Shrenik.
Thank you very much for a brilliant talk. Sorry I joined a few minutes late, but I think I've always been intrigued by Norris planes because they look so beautiful, but I never understood what makes them better than, say, wooden planes or the more modern Stanley style, the Bailey style bench planes. What actually in their design makes them function better?
Yeah, I think it's the standard of workmanship. I mean, this plane, another little story, it's possibly the most accurate and flattest sole of any plane I've ever come across, apart from maybe some that Oliver Sparks has made, but in its size. Years ago, I started a night school class making a violin. And one of the first procedures in making a violin is to take the two halves of the front and back and shoot them perfectly straight and glue them together. And I thought at the time, well, the best thing to do is use the longest plane I've got to do that. I'll use a jointer. And I had a number 7 record, 07 record jointer at the time. I thought I'll use that. I spent hours trying to shoot this joint because on a violin, it is a critical joint. You have got to get it absolutely perfect, because when you start to carve a front and back of a violin, if you haven't got that center joint shot absolutely perfectly, gaps will start to open up as you carve into the wood. I spent hours trying to shoot this joint with this record jointer. I just could not get it right. And I started to question the plane. I thought, I'll tell you what, I'm going to get my Norris out. I know it's shorter, but I'll have a go with that. Within less than a minute, the joint was perfect. And I realised that the record jointer just wasn't flat enough to do the job. But this did it perfectly. And funnily enough, for the rest of the night school class, people kept asking me to bring this plane in and use it whenever anybody wanted to joint their fronts and backs up. So that's one of the accuracy of them is phenomenal. When you get a really good one, and like I say, when the iron and everything matches the body, they spent an awful lot of time making the bed and the iron and everything perfectly match up. And when they're like that, they just absolutely sing. And when you work in difficult grain or anything like that, you just don't have to really worry about it to any great extent, because it just doesn't produce any tear out. So it's a difficult thing to explain, but there is something magical about them. But you have to use one to really understand it, and use a good one, because there are duff ones out there. Because unfortunately, as the irons wore down, people just chucked any other old iron in, and then they won't perform so well, because that iron will not be matched and bedded to the bed of the original plane unless somebody takes the time to rebed a new iron into it. So
Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think Raphael's actually asked the question that I was going to follow up with your comment on how accurate the planes are and how well they are made. So I'll wait for you to get to him.
all right.
Good. Okay, next up, Andy Tuckwell.
Hi, hi Richard. Hi everybody.
Hi, Andy.
Lovely to hear that story again. I just dream of finding a shop like that these days, with somebody running it who's so certain that the customer isn't right, he's right, and it's true. You know, if he'd let you just choose the one you thought you wanted, you wouldn't have had a lovely plane. So
yeah.
We need more people like him.
Yeah.
But if I can take up your thought of widening out the discussion a bit, making comparisons. This is my infill panel plane, which is definitely not a Norris.
Yeah.
I think it's a lovely plane, but it's not of the quality that yours is. But if we sort of play spot the difference, I mean, it's got a Matheson iron in.
Yeah.
There's no other marking on it.
Yeah.
It's a cast panel plane from the 19th century, is as close as I would want to go.
Yeah. Almost certainly Scottish, I would imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's got a big rounded toe.
Yeah. Yeah.
The mouth, you know, you can probably see, I'll put that in front of me, you can see how wide that is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's with the iron set to actually take a reasonable shaving.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it loses there.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I think the size is the same. The handle looks pretty similar.
Yeah, they're all very stylistic, quite similar. Yes, yeah.
But the front bun is much lower than yours. Yours looks really quite.
Yeah, it's the Norris planes tend to be quite high compared to, say, maybe Spears or whatever. I think some people prefer the Spears because they're a bit lower, but I don't mind this at all. But then again, I'm used to it. So,
and it's got 3 great big screw heads on each side.
Yes, yeah.
Hold the infill in.
Yeah, yeah.
A bit battered themselves, so that's another obvious difference.
Yeah.
And it's only beach, but still.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you could find a thicker iron, you might be able to close the mouth up as well. It may not be the original iron.
No, and it's pretty beefy.
Oh right, yeah. Yeah, he probably just opened the mouth of the casting up a little bit too much when he made it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, next up is Jeremy Wright.
Hi. Hey, good, excellent talk. Great story. I'm curious, as a Midwestern United States kind of person, infills are like unicorns. They just don't exist here for sure. But just how prolific were the makers in how common is it to come across of course now with eBay and whatnot, it's probably much more rare, but like how common are infills in the UK?
In the UK on eBay, they're cropping up weekly. There are an awful lot out there. But the thing is, this is one of the things I wanted to try and point out. There are a lot of infills out there, like the one Andy showed there. I think particularly in Scotland, there was a lot of makers or places in the sort of mid to late 19th century where craftsmen could buy what we call the casting, like Andy was saying, that his is a casting, and then they used to infill them themselves and build their own planes up and maybe buy a lever cap. So there's a large number of what I would call sort of almost self-made infills. The likes of Norris, Spears, Matheson, it's a good question. I don't know how many they made. Nobody's really researched this enough, in my opinion. I think it really needs somebody to actually do a bit of serious research to try and work out the numbers that were made. But in this country, it's quite easy to pick an infill up on the net, really, and they crop up. I mean, we had a David Stanley tool auction yesterday, and I would estimate there was probably at least, I don't know, probably 30 infills within that auction yesterday, I would imagine. So yeah, I can understand it must be frustrating in America. There's not so many out there, but in this country they are quite a large number, really. Yeah.
And to go along with that, you mentioned one of the things that makes your plane so special is that it's all the same batch.
Yeah, I was about to say, although they're quite prolific, to find one with its original back iron and iron, I would say out of every 50 infills you look at, there's probably only one that you will find that is still all in with its original setup. That is the rarity, and that's one of the reasons why this plane is so special to me. Yeah.
So if you were to be looking for one, would the assumption be that if they don't match, that you should go ahead and kind of anticipate that you're going to have to replace the iron or the back iron as a way to get it?
Or do a bit of fettling to make the two match, or find another iron or get an iron made. I mean, that's the other thing you could do, is just get somebody, or if you've got the capabilities yourself, get a bit of 01 steel and get it surface ground to the right dimensions. That is the other option to make a really, really good match. And just check that the bed is absolutely flat. You may have to do a bit of scraping on the bed and then rebed with a bit of smoke fitting, or some method of just make it same as I do in wooden planes. It's crucial that iron sits absolutely perfectly on the bed to get something that works really, really well. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Brilliant. Okay, Richard Hughes.
Hi, Richard.
Hello, Richard. Yes, yeah. I just coming back to what you were saying about the violin making. I've got a violin back here. I thought people might like to see it.
That's a good example of what I was talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right. It is a really hard joint to make, particularly the back. It's hard figured maple, and
exactly.
It is a really beastly joint to make. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Richard.
Yeah. Okay, that's it.
All right.
Good, lovely. So Raphael is saying, Richard, can't a Bailey plane be made accurate as well?
I'm not that. I don't really feel proficient enough to talk about Bailey planes. I mean, I think some of the modern planes, like Lee Nielsen, are superbly accurate, and probably can perform just as well. But for me, they haven't quite got that same mystique for me. But and they've got that dreaded thing called an adjuster. I don't like anything that's over complicated in a plane. I'm a great lover of a plane that you adjust with a hammer, but that's just a personal thing. Personally, the simpler the plane, the better for me. But accuracy-wise, I mean, even an older second-hand Stanley or Record, if you've got somebody who's got the capabilities of surface grinding it and redressing the bed, because a lot of them just aren't flat. But then again, cast iron does move around. I think one of the great things about a Norris dovetail plane, they don't seem, once they're made and they're accurate, they stay accurate forever, basically. Whereas a cast iron plane can move around a little bit. So,
all right. Thanks, Richard. Sorry, I was very late, but I'm still at work, so I was taking a break from my writing software to catch the end of the talk.
We've recorded it, Raphael, so you'll be able to catch it up at the beginning as well. So
yeah, I'll do that
on the YouTube channel. Okay, Chester, up next.
Yeah, hello everybody. Hello, Richard.
Yes, sir.
I'm interested in one point about your story that I'd like to hear more about, and it might be difficult for you to relate it because you kind of passed over it a little bit, but I wanted to share with you guys, this is my spears, and it's only 13.5 inches long, and yours looked about the same until I measured it. So I think that's interesting, is yours is about 1.5 inches longer. And of course, mine does not have that toe extension.
Yes.
It does have the high pad in the front, and it has an Ibbotson blade, which I don't know if that's original to spears or not, but they're still very similar. But my point in pointing this out is I did a video about it and comparing it to a Stanley plane, a Stanley Bailey plane. And I have to say that while I was doing that video, I had the strangest sensation of ease and hard to describe, but this plane stood out above my 100 or so of the other Baileys and Stanleys and other things that I've used over my history woodworking. This plane, like a Jaguar on the road, grabbed the wood and rode on it so incredibly smoothly that it actually seemed to be doing the work as opposed to myself when I use a Stanley Bailey. Now, that was my feeling. So my question for you, Richard, is can you describe at all, if you remember, the feeling when you were blindfolded, the feeling that you felt holding that plane and using it for the first time, and differentiate it from what you had been using? That's a complex question, but it intrigues me because I found there was really a substantial emotional thing about it or something. I don't know.
I think you've just explained it perfectly, really. It's almost a mystical thing. I can't really put it into words, but you probably expressed it better than me. There is something strange when you use a really well set up infill. It does, it just becomes part of you, and like you say, the plane just seems to glide across the wood as though you're not even pushing it in a way. It is a strange experience. And until you've actually tried one, I think it's difficult for other people to comprehend what that is. It is something quite unique, but it's very difficult to describe and put into words. I do agree with that perfectly. The blade in your plane may well be original. I think Spears may have used Thomas Ibbotson. They used one or two different iron makers, whereas Norris, as far as I know, stuck to Ward. I think there was a few different iron makers that supply Spears. The main thing is to look for a batch number on the iron, because I think Spears did batch number his irons as well as Norris. So it may be on there somewhere.
Good. Sorry about that, Chester. I muted you because the feedback was coming back. So if you wanted to follow up.
Yeah, that's not a problem. Yeah, I'll have to look for the batch. I don't want to take away from your thing looking for it now. It's not as important to me, but it was just something that it was a feeling that I had with that plane that, and I can't say I attribute it to all of the English planes, but in particular, I've never had a Norris, and this one does not have an adjuster. And I thought that would be a concern for me, but once you set it and you get it right, you don't have to keep resetting it. Whereas with a Stanley and Bailey, Bailey designed Stanley, generally when I start a project, I reset the blade, and I have to do that each time. And generally, this Spears plane, when I take it out, I use it after I use the Stanleys just to perfect a flat surface, and I take off just a shaving, and it just does it beautifully, and you don't realize how out the plane that you used prior to it is until you put this one on it and you see just these little areas of shavings on the board that are coming off, and you realize that it's a flatter surface.
Yeah, exactly how I use this, Chester. It is only, I set it up very finely, and like I say, when I'm finishing my wooden planes, it's just taking those final whispers off to level everything perfectly and leave that mirror finish. Because I try to leave my wooden planes. I don't really sand the surfaces. They're left straight from this Norris. When people can say to me when they pick some of my wooden planes up, God, what have you finished that with? And I'll say that's just straight from the panel plane, from the Norris panel plane, basically. Yeah,
it's amazing. Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
Lovely. Okay, next up is Jim Hendricks.
Hello, Jim. Where are you?
Oh, hang on. Is that better? I can only see Chester is locked on screen on.
Yeah, I'm only seeing Chester at the moment.
I cancelled the spotlight. There we go.
Oh yeah, there you go. So that's it. So am I up now? That's yeah, Richard, it made me laugh, because I mentioned last week, and I let the cat out of the bag about the blindfold, but it's such a brilliant story, and it certainly is one that I've used myself. I actually went over to the tool emporium over at Faversham, and there were some planes. I think they were Spears. Yeah, they were Spears smoothers on the side, and I thought I'll do what Richard did, and I'll see which, because I was contemplating buying one. I didn't buy one because I was too concussed. I turned round with my eyes closed and smacked my head against the fly press. And so that was, so I'm not using that, never going to use that trick again. But going back to Richard was saying about, Andy was saying about Scottish. This one's a similar Scottish casting. And these sort of things where you see patterns inside, and also they have that little V at the back. This one doesn't have it, but the little V, that tends to be a Scottish casting shape. And this is I don't know what somebody's done to that bun, but it's ergonomically brilliant. So that's about a 14-inch, I think. On the Spears Chester, this is the same as yours. I'll have to go back a bit because this is same as Richard's, 15.5-inch. So as you said, the extensions are on the toe and the heel, as you can see there. And this, interestingly, Richard, I've never looked, but this one's got a 4 on the bed, a 4 on the cap iron, and a 4 on the iron, which is actually a Sorby, but it looks like an original old Sorby. So that was ex-David Barron. But yeah, it's I think the word that Chester was trying to come up with, which I've mentioned before, and I think people know my view on the infill panel plane, is the inertia. The inertia that you create when you're driving the plane, you're pushing it forward, and its sheer weight carries it forward with authority, I think. And I think the analogy would be if you were trying to knock a post in the ground and you had a small club hammer, and then you get yourself a sodding great sledgehammer and hit it. And it's that effectiveness, and that drives it with authority if you've got a sharp edge through the wood. And to me, I just sum it up by calling it mojo. And I think, that's what I've kind of used as my description for infill panel planes. I think that applies particularly to panel planes of that period. But yeah. So, but thank you very much for your story. I thought it reminded me of my headache for the rest of the day.
Thank you, Jim.
Lovely. Okay, Rusty, we haven't seen you for a while, so good to see you back.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, work got in the way. Great, Richard, thank you for the wonderful talk. I have 2 questions for you. One is, since I have one of your planes, which I think is my favorite plane to use, how does the feeling of this Norris relate to using a good wooden plane, both for panel, and the second question is specifically for smoothers or coffin smoothers? There's a very special feeling for me when I use a wooden coffin smoother, but I've never used a infill smoother of the same size?
Hi, Rusty. Sorry. It's. I think wooden planes have definitely got their place. I mean, in the workshop, if I'm sort of knocking off a lot of wood, I use my 4-plane all the time. I love my 4-plane, and the thing is, I use my wooden planes particularly in my research. As an 18th or 19th century craftsman would have done. They've got to remove a lot of wood rapidly, and they're likely to be doing it for 10, 11 hours a day. And there's no way I'd want to use an infill plane to be removing wood all day long. They're just too heavy. It's a completely different beast. Like I say, I only use it for those very, very fine jobs, taking very, very fine passes. It's interesting that you said about the coffin smoothers. Over the years, I've found myself using smoothers less and less and less, funnily enough. It's the least used plane in my workshop, a smoother. I've got a couple of smoothers, but I very rarely use them. I use my woodies. I use a tri-plane and my 4-plane. I have a early spears that I use as my general rough plane for a lot of things. So it sounds crazy to use an infill for a rough plane. The Norris for very, very fine finishing, and I have a Lee Nielsen block plane which I use for quite a lot of rough work, and then my other block plane is this little Ollie Sparks slipper plane. That's I use for very fine detail. I use that for final finishing, but I tend to go from a panel size to a block plane. I seem to have lost the use of a smoother. I very, very rarely use a smoother these days, but that's just me. That's just my own personal way of working personally. Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. And what do you have against the adjusters?
What do I have against them? I don't know. It's more moving parts to go on. The Norris adjuster, in my opinion, is it's a very clever idea, but the threads wear out, and one of the main reasons the threads wear out is because to effectively adjust them without damaging the threads, you've got to relieve the tension on the lever cap every time. And that's a pain in the neck, basically, having to relieve the tension on the lever cap to make an adjustment and then tighten it back up. I just couldn't be bothered with all that. So on an infill plane, like Chester was saying, it is for your very final finishing. I sharpen it and I set it up for a very fine cut, and I never alter that setting until I come to sharpen it again. So I don't really need an adjuster. And on the wooden planes, you know how easy they are to adjust with a hammer and a strike button. Once you get used to them, you don't need an adjuster at all. So I don't, apart from the block, the Lee Nielsen block plane, I don't really have anything with an adjuster. I don't think the hammer is my only adjuster in the workshop, really.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks again.
Okay.
Great. So Shrenik's up for round 2.
Hi again, Richard. I see Rusty's having a great time on the beach.
Yes.
With panel planes or with these infill planes, are they set up exactly the same as a wooden plane, or are they set different? Is there a slightly different process to setting them?
The only difference, it's the same old thing. I tend to set the blade back so it's not really cutting at all. When I set my Norris panel plane up, I've got a bit of wood, I've got a bit of walnut somewhere at the side of the bench. I've had it for ages. It's very thin. I'll chuck that in the vise, and I will feel the iron with my fingers underneath and set it so it's just back a little bit. And then I will make fine taps with a hammer just to tap it forward. And then I will test it on the thin strip of wood, both sides of the plane. And if I find it's not cutting one side and it's cutting the other, I will laterally adjust with a hammer. if I over adjust and it goes too deep, this is the big difference between a wooden plane. I'll just forget it, undo the lever cap, move it back and start all over again. I mean, it sounds laborious, but it's something that takes seconds to do, to be honest with you. I won't try and back the iron off by hitting the plane because it's an infill, it's beautiful. I'm not going to hit it with a hammer. Whereas a wooden plane, you can hit the back of the plane or hit a strike button at the front to back the iron off. That a wooden plane is probably easier to adjust in a way than a Norris panel plane, but with this plane, like I say, it's something you set up. It probably still only takes me a matter of 30 seconds or whatever to set it up because I'm so used to it. But once that's set, that's it until the next time I sharpen it. So it's not something that gets constantly readjusted. So that's the main difference between that and a woody, basically. A woody, I will sort of back the iron off or put more cut on, sort of move them backwards and forwards. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Matthias, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Richard. It was a very interesting talk. Being of a continental persuasion, I am very unfamiliar with infill planes, as you can imagine. Has the sound gone away?
Sorry?
Yeah, no, sorry. I didn't get any sound back, so I was wondering if...
Yeah, no, I can hear you. Yeah, that's fine.
And when I was doing woodwork, when I had woodwork at school in the 70s, we only ever used wooden planes. That was the only thing they had in our wood workshop. But and these days I'm working with mainly with Lie-Nielsen planes. But I was wondering about if one at some point or other were interested in going down the infill route. How many frogs does one have to kiss before there's the magic smoke and one of them turns into something looking like a prince? I sort of take it that your experience there, that you did indeed strike rather lucky when you got that one.
I did. It is a tricky one, that is, because going back to what I was just talking about, smoothers, yeah. I have gone through, I think I probably bought 4 or 5 infill smoothers. Yeah. And eventually actually gave up. What I did in the end with a smoother is I bought a casting of an old plane, an old Scottish gunmetal casting off of eBay, yeah. And I re-stuffed it with my own infills, found a really good wrought iron, sweated a steel sole on it, and made a plane that fitted me. I never found a smoother. I have actually got one Norris smoother that I get on reasonably well with, but it's what they call a bun back. It's a number 4, so it has no handle. I don't mind this one, actually. I can get on with that quite well. But ones with an actual tote or handle, whatever, I never really gelled with any of them. I couldn't get on with any of them. So it's not easy finding one that actually. I was very, very lucky with that panel plane in the first instance.
And also, particularly obviously, if one is buying off of eBay or even an auction that's held somewhere where you can't attend. Yeah. You can't. To be able to try something out before you buy it is very, very rare.
Very difficult, yes, yeah. I totally agree. It's not easy. No. It's not an easy one to do.
Out of curiosity, I mean, obviously the very first one you bought, the one that you got of your mate at work for 25 quid, or the equivalent of it, may I assume that for the panel one, you did not pay the equivalent of a new Stanley at the time?
No, I can remember exactly what we paid for it. It was £125 at the time, which was quite a lot of money back then, but I don't think my mother paid for it entirely. I think I chipped in a bit as well, but yeah, it was quite a lot of money back at the time, but it was a good investment. Prices have fluctuated a lot. I can remember a time where that plane would have probably fetched at auction in the region of £1,200. Mm-hmm. Now that's dropped quite back down a bit. With it having its original iron and everything, I feel it probably should be worth more than what a lot of them are that are not all original. I would estimate its value maybe at the moment, maybe at around £700, but I'm guessing. I really am guessing.
I think, well, I'm very uninterested in the collector's monetary value of tools.
Yeah.
I consider myself very much a user. I also play music. I hate instrument collectors. Play music and you need 50 instruments to do it, it's fine. But if you're just going to stick them on the wall or behind glass, you are taking somebody else's dream away from them.
Yeah. I mean, I think some people think I'm a little bit crazy sometimes using such fine planes in my everyday work, but I still consider them, they're tools, and I love using them every day. I'd hate to think of it set on a shelf somewhere. Yeah.
That I can only say, good on you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Lovely. Josh, we haven't seen you for a while. Good to see you back. So, Josh, up to your question.
Yeah, I guess another economist. So I hope I'm not exceeding a quota here or something. But yeah, Rusty pointed that out. So I'm unfamiliar with panel planes completely, and so I was wondering kind of where they evolved from, for what uses, because it's sort of, you have something the size of a jack plane, but that's being used more like a smoother, and so kind of why this giant smoother?
Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't mean to touch on that in the talk, and I forgot about it. I've often wondered that myself. They were listed in Stuart Spears and Norris and Matheson catalogues as panel planes, and I've often wondered where the term came from. I've recently been doing a bit of historical research into 18th century wooden planes and the names of wooden planes in the 18th century, and going through old records. And we've obviously got the word foreplane, which was a plane that was somewhere between 14 and 17 inches long, more often called a jack plane. But I have found some records in the 18th century in the Old Bailey, which are legal things, that were listing court records of where tools were stolen. And I have found a few references to planes that were called panel planes in the 18th century. Now, they could have been what we call panel raising planes, which make the fielded panels. But the other interesting thing in the Old Bailey transcripts is they list the value of the planes. And on the odd occasion where I've found them listed as panel planes, not panel fielding or whatever, the planes have been quite a lowly value, more in the sort of value of a jack plane. Now, I've a suspicion that they may have been making shorter wooden planes, maybe 12, 14 inches long, that were used more as a finishing plane for maybe finishing panels for doors or cabinets or whatever. So I'm wondering whether this term panel plane comes from that. And these planes are generally used for smoothing sort of larger surfaces of timber to a fine finish, and they probably just wanted to get them flatter than trying to just use a smoother, which may not have flattened them out. I mean, you can still do it with a triplane, really, but I'm wondering whether that's where the term came from, really. Yeah.
Although it sounds like it's enormously flatter, especially than my triplane, which is
yeah.
But yeah, it's also interesting you're using the crime data. I didn't.
Oh, well, when you're researching the 18th century, it's a really good reference. Yeah.
It's surprising how reliable things like crime and mortality can be. Like, someone died, someone stole my plane.
Yeah.
You write that down.
It's a very useful resource. Yes.
I think that's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. So next up, Chester wants to go again. So Chester.
Hi, Chester.
There you go. I wanted to point out, there's an old story in the theater And it's a story about an actress who had an argument with the main actor on stage. And so when she left the stage to upstage the other actor, she left a wine glass on the edge of the fireplace mantle, sitting on the edge as if it might fall off. And the entire audience stared at that glass on the fireplace and didn't pay any attention to the actor whose lines were coming up. The reason I bring that up is that something was afoot just a few minutes ago. The lady behind you moved all those planes, I thought, into view so that we could see them better. But on the other hand, all of a sudden a foot came into the picture in the frame. And she put her best foot forward and it sat there tapping while you were talking. And it distracted me completely from your conversation. But I thought I'd let you know because you probably didn't notice it.
I didn't notice it. That's my dear wife, Kate.
Well, it was. I just thought I'd point that out to you. Go ahead, Geoffrey.
we have our own inspector here now. Oh, there we go. Okay, Eric, good to see you again. Haven't seen you for a while.
Hi there. Hi there. Oh, it's good to be back. But I was wanting to ask a question that I've always been fascinated by infill planes because they look so beautiful, and I would like to own one. But if it's an investment purchase, I'm looking for a user. What sort of size should they go for? Are you better with a sort of small, smoother plane or something longer, like a panel plane? I thinking about, for making sort of furniture, tables, chairs, shelves, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if I was looking for just one infill plane, that could perform a number of issues, like I was saying, I often use this panel plane for jointing smaller pieces for furniture, which you couldn't do with a smoother, but you can smooth things with a panel plane. So as a general all-round infill plane, I think a panel plane is probably a good place to start, to be honest with you. They're obviously somewhat more pricey than the smoothers usually, but as an all-round plane, if you're only going to own one infill plane, I think a panel plane would probably be the best choice. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thanks very much, Richard. I mean, the other question is whether to go for a newly made one or go for a more antique market, Spears Rare or Norris. I mean, I suspect I know which side you might be on in that, but there's some very capable. We talked about Oliver Sparks earlier. There's some very capable makers out there. So I don't know what to.
Well, it all depends on how deep your pockets are, really. I mean, modern makers. The thing is, say, take somebody like Oliver Sparks. I don't think I've ever known him make anything on the size of a panel plane. He's often said to me he'd like to make one, but it would probably be very expensive. It would probably be, make it out of most people's reach. Cole Holty obviously has made a few panel planes. Bill has made jointers, but there's not many makers that tackle things that big. Modern makers tend to go for smaller things like smoothers. I mean, Conrad Sawyer makes some beautiful panel planes though, in America. But I mean, if you've got the money, I've got no qualms about people using modern infills. I think they're fantastic. But it's just, this price-wise, it's whether, obviously, vintage planes are relatively cheaper compared to modern makers, but you have got that problem, as I was saying, is unless you can actually physically handle it and try it, rather than just buying it off the internet, you're not going to know really how well tuned it is until you get it in your hands. So, whereas if you're buying from a modern maker, in theory, it should be perfect from the word go.
I mean, that's something I need to think about. You know, as you say, exactly, you're going to get one that's good to go. Whereas you might buy a pig in a poke, buying something off eBay or even at an auction, because you haven't had a chance to try it. I suppose you can always sell it on, but I don't like the idea of having to do that, selling something that I wasn't happy with. So I'll need to do my thinking. But thanks very much.
All right, thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. I think that maybe that's an idea that we could maybe do at the next show that we put on. Maybe we could have a section where people bring their best users, and literally everybody then can have a go. So then they can get a feel for different planes. You know, a lot of us have got various different planes. A lot of us like different makers. You know, and we could bring them all in, and we could have a go, you know, with some different types of wood, and give everybody a chance, so that people that haven't had the chance of using a Ollie Sparks or a Carl Holty or a Bill Carter, or I mean, you know, some of the ones I've got Daryl Hutchinson. You know, we could look at the Norrises, we can look at you know, all sorts of different things, and maybe Derek, that's something that we could put on at the next London International Festival of Woodworking. So thumbs up there. So everybody, I want to take this opportunity to thank Richard. Richard, yet again, I mean, it's absolutely your knowledge and your ability to share your passion over your hobby and your not just your hobby, your income. It is absolutely brilliant. So thank you very much, Richard. So if everybody could raise their glasses, so raise their bench beverages, and toast Richard and a bench.
Cheers, Geoffrey.
It's a high-tech conversation.
And a low-tech topic.
Live on the World Wide Web via Zoom. Bench Talk 101.